Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the West Express, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at westexpress.com. And the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Subscriptions available at bakerstreetirregulars.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 151. Memoirs from Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Oh, well, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And I'm busily toiling away here in the IHO's kitchens on a secret recipe which we will test later on. Maybe we can get folks to test it out when we see them in Indiana.
Oh, what a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been working on my no-churn prime rib roast.
Well, really, that is the best way to make it. No churn.
I think so, yeah.
I'm going to see if I can sous vide a kidney pie. That'd be an interesting approach. Yeah. Have you heard of the sous vide?
Oh, yes. I experiment with that. I've got a sous vide set up. That was one of the nice things that happened over the last year or so, was the rise of very economical methods of trying this out. For those of our listeners who don't know what it is, you should give them a quick explanation of sous vide.
Yeah, so sous vide is basically an immersion method of cooking. The food gets sealed in some sort of container, usually a plastic bag or a vacuum-sealed apparatus, and gets immersed in a water bath. The water does not touch the food itself. It simply surrounds the containing device. And you can regulate the temperature very specifically to cook the food. And it's almost like it's halfway between a pressure cooker and a slow cooker, if you will. And it allows you to, infuse wonderful flavors and to cook your foods until they're perfectly tender. And usually when they come out, I don't know if you do this, Bert, in your sous vide experiments. When they come out, I like to sear them, either in a frying pan or with a torch, blowtorch in the kitchen, to give them that nice caramelized finish there. So many great ways to experiment with food with a sous vide.
Yes, you can cook the most challenging bits of protein for a very long while at a very low temperature in a hot water bath. And then at the end of it, after taking it out of that hot water bath, and as Scott says, searing it or putting it under a broiler, you can truly appreciate the full naming of sous vide, because the name, of course, is French for let's go get pizza. And then you just get rid of all that hot water, get rid of that charred protein, and get yourself, a reasonably good pesto pie. We usually like that.
There you go. Well, on to other places, good and great. We of course need to remind you that this episode in particular, is available at ihos.co/ihos151, ihos.co/ihos151, all lowercase. We are I Hear of Sherlock on all of the social platforms. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We share updates and interact with folks there. Lots of stuff going on. And we tend to update the website, ihearofsherlock.com, on occasion, although it has slowed down a little bit during the summer. We are anticipating a pickup in the fall. And there you can find ways to interact with us as well. Send us an email, leave a comment, and support the show. We ask your support in one or both of two ways. Leave us a rating or review on iTunes. You don't have to be an Apple user to do that, but it would help other people find the show, which we always like to have happen. And the other way to support us is financially. We have a couple of options there, PayPal or Patreon, either a one-time or an ongoing support for what you hear through your ears right now. Your contributions are greatly appreciated.
Yes, and you can also call us. Please, we still have our telephonic connectivity, 774-221-READ, 774-221-7323. Leave us a comment. And you could also telegram. Send us a telegram to iHose America. That's also good for the transatlantic cable. We love receiving those, and we will send you back a COD reply.
Well, no COD accepted at this next place, our friends at Wessex Press.
The ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex is looking forward to the 10th of September, when we mark the death of St. Frithestan of Winchester in 933. We celebrate those who enrich our lives, as you will celebrate the treasures found in Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the Newspapers, Volume 3, edited by Matthias Bostrom and Matt Laffey. These restored, newly typeset stories for the last 6 months of 1893 show Conan Doyle, the celebrated author, lecturing on the novelists of the day, and they report the presumed death of Sherlock Holmes at the Reichenbach Falls. This essential volume for your library is available right now at our wessexpress.com. Friends, it's September. Fly the white clouds like tattered sails of ships. The treetops lash the air with sounding whips. As the seasons shift, reach for the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
Lo, hear the lark. Yes, lovely dulcet tones there. Well, we are going to be fortunate enough to be joining our friends at Wessex Press in Bloomington, Indiana, in very short order for Gillette to Brett 5. It's going to be very exciting. And
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. And maybe we'll do a live broadcast if we can figure that out.
Yeah,
it might be great fun. We'll see. Stay tuned for that.
I know somebody who's really good at social media. We could ask him about that. We can probably, use FaceChat or BookSnap or one of those platform things.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'd love to meet him if you can introduce me. That would be fantastic. Well, we are delighted this time around to welcome Wendy Heyman-Marsaw to the program. Wendy is actually a New York native, but comes to us from the East Coast of Canada. Her youthful indoctrination of the Sherlockian world was kindled by, a certain deerstalker-toting father in her life. And Wendy, of course, was able to expand her sights in London, as she attended London Polytechnic in 1972 and was an early member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. She then emigrated to Canada in the late 70s and began a career in advertising. She is in Halifax now having retired, and joined the Spence Munros and the Bootmakers of Toronto. And it was here that she began to write a series of columns for Canadian Holmes. That is, of course, the publication of the Master Bootmakers. Earned her Master Bootmaker title just a couple of years ago. And those articles focused on the rather unique perspective of Mrs. Hudson as the landlady of 221B Baker Street. and the scope of the articles therein included links to the Canon and various Victorian influences and recipes pertaining to the subject of each column. She managed to edit those columns and provide some additional material to create this book, the Memoirs from Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen. And we will be talking with Wendy specifically about that. So, Wendy, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you very much, Scott and Bert. I'm delighted to be with you today.
Excellent. Well, we are really looking forward to delving into more about Mrs. Hudson with you. It's a topic that we covered a little bit over on Trifles, our other podcast, but obviously that was a shorter and more academic approach. And I think looking into Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen and your very unique way of kind of parsing out who Mrs. Hudson was and what she did should be a lot of fun today.
I hope so.
Now, before we get to that, we will do what we do with all of our guests and ask you to go back in your mind and tell us how you first came across this character of Sherlock Holmes.
Well, my dad was a first-generation Sherlockian. He was a pipe-smoking Anglophile, absolutely enthralled by the Basil Rathbone films. And I think he was the only guy who wore a deerstalker on the New York City subway system. But he gave me my first copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes when I was 8 years old. And we took family trips up to Gillette Castle in Connecticut. And in 1965, I saw the production of Baker Street on Broadway starring Fritz Weaver. And it just continued from there. My letters in university were addressed as Sherlocka, signed Mycroft the Dad. And I went to the Polytechnic of Central London for a year, and I joined the Sherlock Holmes Society while I was there.
Wow, that is a very interesting history. Now, 8 years old, were you actually reading the stories at that point?
Oh, yes. I was a very prolific reader when I was a little kid. Still am. And I just was fascinated myself. So I grew up with the Basil Rathbone movies, and every chance I got, I would seek out, as I said, in 1972, when I was in the Polytechnic of Central London, I joined the Sherlock Holmes Society of London whilst I was there. And then I worked in advertising for about 32 years, 35 years. And British Airways was one of my clients, so I would get to go over to London every quarter. And during that time, Jeremy Brett's Granada Productions had just started.
Oh, yeah.
And it continued from there, from my first birthday party for my son when he was 6 years old. It was a Sherlock Holmes themed birthday party with Pin the Pipe on Sherlock. So, and now I'm a member of the Bootmakers of Toronto. I was made a master bootmaker in 2016. I'm a proud member of the Spence Monroes in Halifax, led by Mark Alberstadt and his wife Joanne Alberstadt. And it's just been terrific. It's a lifelong love.
Now, I think I had noted someplace that you also had some intersections early on with someone that we've mentioned before on these shows, Chris Steinbrunner. Is that right?
Yes, I worked with Chris when my first job out of university at WOR-TV in New York. And Chris was a member of the BSI, and of course he won the Edgar Award for his book. And over the water cooler, as they say, Chris would regale me with wonderful stories about what was happening at the BSI meetings he attended. And what he was in charge of the movies that were being shown on WOR. And it was $1 Million Movie was always on at 7 o'clock at night. And he could be persuaded to run a Basil Rathbone every once in a while, very, very, very easily. He's a delightful man.
Yeah, he really was. We talk about him from from time to time. Did you not in those days? I mean, I think in those days was he still connected to the Priory Scholars up at Fordham? Did you get involved in any New York scions?
No, I didn't get involved in the New York scions. I was tempted to join ASH, but I quickly after I was in New York. I moved to Canada in 1979, so I wasn't in New York working very long, and I had a wonderful opportunity to come up here, and I'm now a Canadian citizen and very happy. I love it, but I miss New York. Certain things that you can't get up here. Egg creams.
Well, we can always send you some Fox's You Bet. I mean, that's easy.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's my favorite. I have a recipe for a Fox's You Bet cake.
Really?
Yes.
All right. Well, I got to get your address when we're all done, and I'll post you some Fox's You Bet in exchange for the recipe.
I think you like my address because it's Pondicherry Crescent.
That's great.
Well, how did you with that sort of background, so there you are. At what point in all this did you get sort of focused on Mrs. Hudson? Did that sort of loom large for you as a area of interest?
Well, it was when I joined the Spence Monroes in Halifax, and we had our Bootmakers journal that came out, and Mark used to do a Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen little piece that had just a simple recipe from Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen. It could be something like Sally Lund cake or something like that. And then I got the idea of saying, perhaps we can do something a little bit more with the Mrs. Hudson character and get into a bit of the social and cultural happenings around her. And she had a new way of looking. I had a new way of looking at Mrs. Hudson. I think she had a wonderful, unique, and intimate knowledge of her tenants that nobody else could share. She was a woman of great loyalty and discretion. And I think that I saw her, unlike the way she was portrayed previously, I saw her as a much younger and much more vital member of the household, and to be flexible and tolerant and brave in the face of the worst tenant in London, as John Watson called him. I think she was probably, just a bit more compelling a character than she had been portrayed.
Interesting. And did you also have an interest in cooking? I mean, were you just intrigued by Victorian food, or was that just sort of a way to get to Mrs. Hudson as a character?
Well, I'm a great foodie. I have a collection of over 100 cookbooks, and the Victorian and Edwardian periods have always been an area of interest for me. I majored in history and communications in university, so I love that time period, and it was a new way of looking at Victorian Edwardian culture through the eyes of the Canon, a new way of looking at the Victorian Edwardian food fitting into that culture and relating it back to the Canon once again. So the recipes were linked to the activities of Holmes and Watson as they went about their business, whether it was dinner on a train or, of course, having dinner at Simpson's on the Strand. And it gave me an opportunity to really research what these venues and areas were like. And I got a great kick out of it.
So are you going to add to your collection of cookbooks with one authored by yourself? Have you thought about curating a cookbook of Holmesian or Victorian recipes? Because that's been done over the years, but there's always room for another one.
Well, I do have a website and blog. That's www.mrshudsonskitchen.com. And in that blog, I cover things like Victorian Christmas and the Crystal Palace, and I have a new blog I'm working on dealing with Sherlock's disguises and London street food, which he would have had to enjoy while he was in disguise. And I'm working on it through that and keeping that alive, keeping it green, as you say, through that venue.
So tell us a little bit about your theory behind Mrs. Hudson as a contemporary, because we think of Mrs. Hudson through the eyes of actresses who have played her, like Rosalie Williams in the Granada series or Mary Gordon in the Rathbone films, and we certainly read of Mrs. Hudson's quote unquote stately tread upstairs.
Yes.
That tends to have us think of Mrs. Hudson as this middle-aged to elderly, kind of landlady. But you've taken a very different approach. So tell us about the Mrs. Hudson that you uncovered.
Well, the stately tread could be traced to the instruction in deportment that all young upper middle class ladies were sent to school to learn, and from balancing the book on the head, and that could account for her stately tread. She probably was a woman. I envision her with a father who was a lawyer, who educated her more so than other young Victorian women were educated. And she married an architect who unfortunately was killed, and she came to inherit 221B upon his death. And it was interesting because looking back at how women were allowed to own property was very difficult in the 1870s and going through to the 1887, when they were finally allowed to own some property of their own. So the only way she could have gotten 221B was through the death of her husband.
That's pretty ingenious, but it makes total sense.
So that's kind of the way I saw her as a women's rights advocate for property ownership, and I could see her as a suffragette. And going to the Criterion for the suffragette meetings they used to have there in a special room, which is, of course, where John Watson started his encounter with Sherlock Holmes.
So what is that? What's as you think about that and that arc, that trajectory, and you've said that one of the things that intrigued you here was the research, the Victorian period, your interest in history. So at that time, in terms of popular culture, popular society, Victorian society, there were, let's put it this way, fairly rigid values around the role of women. So how do these things connect? How does your view of Mrs. Hudson connect with sort of the role? Because you just mentioned suffragette, which really sort of puts her at the progressive end of the spectrum. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that she was at the more progressive end of the spectrum because she was a property owner. And she was a property owner not just for some quiet tenants. I mean, she had criminals in her home. She had the Baker Street irregulars tromping through the hallways. And she had to be a woman of great understanding and patience and tolerance. And I think she was quite brave in the empty house when she was working with Sherlock Holmes, crawling on the floors. You're not going to get an old, elderly woman to be as nimble as that, I think. So I do believe that she was a woman of her time, but more of a radical feminist, if I can use that expression to describe her, in a Victorian kind of way. She certainly appreciated Victorian values and dress and all of those kinds of constraints, but within that, she found her way through society and culture to become her own woman and in her own right.
Well, so tell me a little bit about the structure of the book, because this is really interesting. So you have a view of Mrs. Hudson as this sort of progressive proto-feminist, a property owner whose day includes people tramping up and down the stairs, perhaps people falling on the floor in Baker Street, windows shattered by air guns. And yet, she's also keeping life going.
On the walls.
Right. Bullet pox in her plaster. But she's also keeping the place going. She's cooking, and you have this interest in food. So with that start of Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen, those early columns in the Canadian publication. So how does your book sort of tell this story?
Well, it's a series of vignettes, I think you can call them. And to take an interest in what came out of the Canon, what did Sherlock and Dr. Watson do in terms of their travels and their being in certain areas, which would, for example, Devonshire, which has its own wonderful regional foods, and going dining in Baskerville Hall, where he would be, of course, served magnificent meals. And at some of his other clients, again, he would be served these huge Victorian dinners and everything like that. And that goes all the way to the cold collation that would be prepared if he was arriving late at night at a place, and they would put out a cold meal for him, and also the inns that they traveled to, and the recipes that were popular at the inns in those days. So I took great care in finding recipes that worked with the location that they were in, and how it related to the story. So if he was at Baskerville Hall, it was a description of the kind of meal he would have and the recipes that he would have. And also, when he entertained the Felney Jones, and he made himself, made the tray of oysters and wines, what he termed as dusty, spidery, I think, wines. He was somewhat of a gourmet, and he fixed it himself and felt that Dr. Watson didn't quite appreciate his abilities as a homemaker.
And we're just going to pause here a minute for a brief word from our sponsor. While you've heard the Baker Street Journal called the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946, we have a question for you. What does that really mean? It could simply mean that it was the first of its kind. See, before 1946, no one was producing a regular or even irregular collection of scholarship on a regular basis. It could also mean that it's the definitive resource that many Sherlockians turn to when they're looking to delve into ideas, past and present, on issues small and grand in the canon, just like we do over on Trifles. Or it could mean that you've simply exhausted your Google search and arrived at BakerStreetIrregulars.com, where you stare in amazement at the myriad of choices before you. Whatever it means to you, it's clearer than ever before. The Baker Street Journal stands out amid a sea of electronic information about Sherlock Holmes as a beacon of some of the most intelligent and thoughtful papers you're likely to read on the Sherlock Holmes stories, films, programs, and more. The real question is this: why don't you subscribe yet? For less than $1 a week, you can have access to all of this and more. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe today.
Yeah, so in doing all this, so have you cooked all of the things that you refer to in your book? I mean, were there any, when you go back and look at those Victorian cookbooks. I mean, one of the things you find is that they use but they certainly use a great number of ingredients that time has moved on today. I mean, you can still put lard and crust, but the use of, fats and beef fats and tallow and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Did you have any adventures in exploring these recipes?
Yes, very much so. In fact, the one that sticks out in my mind is the recipe for shortbread, where they just specified sugar. And when I made it, I realized it should have been confectioner's sugar. Huh. So that came out tasting a bit sandy, but it's authentic. And I relied on Mrs. Beaton's cookbook quite a bit for some of her recipes, and I loved her curry recipe. She gave this huge recipe and then said you'd be better off just buying it at your local purveyor. So she discouraged the making of, using 25 different herbs and spices to come up with an authentic Indian curry.
Are there dishes that that have now sort of become regular staples that turn up every week or so in your household because of all of this work? I mean, are you regularly serving pâté de foie gras pie?
No, I wish. I think I'm a little turned off by foie gras pie. I have a daughter who's a vegan and would not take kindly to that. But the basmati rice, I do make pork vindaloo quite regularly. I'd say that's every 2 weeks. And there are some other recipes that are part of my my repertoire that I can include. And my husband is a good lover of curries, and he served in the Royal Canadian Navy. So mushrooms on toast and toad in the hole and bubble and squeak and the no-churn mint chip ice cream were great. Prime rib, standing rib roast is a must at Christmas with Yorkshire pudding, but mine tend to come out like Yorkshire hockey pucks.
Well, it's truly Canadian. That's good.
But Yorkshire pudding is like a popover.
I know. It should be the easiest thing in the world, and I have to admit that it takes me some doing to make. But the tobacco cookies, I think I'll give a miss to making those again. But the Devonshire chicken dumplings are terrific, and the eggs a la Russe are very, very simple to make. The chocolate truffles are easy, and the Turkish smoked eggplant with yogurt, I'm not going to even try to pronounce that name, Patalas Namisi. That came from one of my favorite vignettes in the book where they go to the Turkish bath. And I just thought that was a great thing because the Turkish baths were not only for the wealthy, well-to-do, upper-class Brits, they were also open to the middle and middle-lower-class Brits. So Londoners had the chance to frequent those. And the importance of the coffee houses was also another thing that amazed me. It was a place where they would get their newspapers, and the running patters would come in and give them the latest headlines, and the political discussions would take place, and it was quite a social scene. There were thousands of coffee houses in London in the old days.
So cycling back to Mrs. Hudson, with all of this, with this great range of culinary experiments and this sort of progressive proto-feminist. So in your view, as you conceive of Mrs. Hudson as a character, how did she come by all this knowledge and skill? I mean, she sounds like pretty much a Victorian superwoman to be able to do all this.
Well, I think she is an unusual woman. She did have to master cooking as as a woman of her class did, and she made herself into a role. Although she was the landlady, she was the chief cook and bottle washer as well, which was an unusual role for a landlady, which is why I think she did get to know Holmes and Watson a lot more intimately than the books would have us believe. And she was only in, I believe it was 9 stories. But I think if they had her as a character in the new Sherlock series, she is a little bit more of a participant in their affairs, but she does make it clear that she does not cook and leaves the kitchen duties up to Holmes and Watson. But in the Jeremy Brett and and certainly in the Basil Rathbone, she's much more of a servile character.
So do you
I think she just loved cooking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's
out in a hole for the regulars, and how could she ignore these poor little children and not feed them?
Well, and surmising as you have of her widowhood, which makes great sense in terms of her ownership of the house, it could very well be that she never had children of her own, and this could be a proxy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I believe that her husband was killed soon after they were married, and a woman's picture or her name should appear in Victorian times only at the time of her birth, her marriage, and her death. So that's why on my website I have a picture of what I envisioned Mrs. Hudson to look like. And she was quite an attractive-looking woman who would appeal to someone of an upper class or middle class occupation, such as an architect. I could see 221B with bow window being wonderful light for an architect to work in.
And who but an architect could craft a layout for 221B that accommodates all the various scenarios that we come across over the 60 stories? Exactly.
I think that he didn't design 221. He chose 221B. But in the story that I wrote about him, I saw him building his own home for himself and Mrs. Hudson, which is why I believe that he died fairly early, and she was on her own, and she was looking for a tenant, and she makes no mention, or there is no mention of prior tenants in 221B. So it's quite likely that she met Sherlock when she was in her 20s and he was in his 20s.
Oh, interesting. So following that, how likely do you think it was that she was in fact the Martha that was mentioned in his last bow in 1914, whom, as we all know, Vincent Sterrett has long surmised was Mrs. Hudson, who then moved from the city to the country and stayed in service of Sherlock Holmes?
I don't, with all due respect for such an eminent scholar as Starrett, I don't believe that she was Martha. Martha was a housekeeper and described as a housekeeper. And that's not what Mrs. Hudson was. She was a cut above that. And I can't see her leaving to go and work at in Surrey. I'm sorry, is it Surrey?
Sussex, I think.
Sussex, yes, Sussex. Sorry.
Down on the coast.
Sussex Downs. No, I can't see her being the Martha of that. And the Mrs. There was a woman who took her place, or one of the Conan Doyle idiosyncrasies that another Mrs. Turner was looking after the meals. And I surmised that was probably her sister-in-law who came to sit in for a day while she was going out to a suffragette meeting.
Yeah. Well, certainly given that that character makeup that you've worked out, I would agree that Martha character does not sound at all like the Mrs. Hudson that we know, this strong and independent woman, unless I'm going to go out on a ledge here. Watson was simply covering for what later resulted in an official unification of these two grand characters, Mrs. Hudson and Sherlock Holmes, in Matrimony.
In Matrimony?
Yeah. I mean, what if Martha was actually, what if she were Mrs. Hudson and she and Holmes were married and living together down in Sussex, and Watson was simply providing a little bit of artistic license to cover for it?
Well, I could see, although they refer to old Martha, I could see that being a possibility given my perception of her as being a younger woman. And it's not impossible to see Holmes and Mrs. Hudson marry in their 40s when he retired.
Right.
So that would be a very romantic kind of vignette yet to be written.
Now, do you have a favorite essay in the book, something that really stands out to you or really you think typifies what people should read when they get the book?
Oh, well, one of my favorites is definitely the Turkish bath one. I just find the interaction between Holmes and Watson in that circumstance to be very, very interesting. And, their discussions in the cooling room and things like that, I think, are compelling. There's a couple of other stories that I liked. The Criterion Bar and the Holborn Restaurant, I believe, was interesting because that, of course, is where Watson meets up with Stamford. And he claims Watson is talking about how poor he is, yet he goes to the Criterion, which is one of the most expensive places in the Holborn Restaurant as well. Another one that I quite like was the dining car. They used train travel so much, and dining on a dining car, the advent of the dining car was just around the time of Holmes and Watson. And they used to train the servers with blindfolds.
Oh, wow.
So, and serve very, very wonderful meals until that they started serving terrible sandwiches and things like that they have nowadays. But the meals were quite sumptuous, and the preparation was beautiful. The service was fantastic. These guys could get around with blindfolds.
That comes in handy when you get into those tunnels. Oh. Now, there's one piece of personal information that you share about yourself, and I think it's a fairly unique one, although we have run into a couple of other people with this. You have a certain type of bodily decoration. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yes, I do have a tattoo. It's done by my son-in-law, who's a tattoo artist.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yes. And it's a profile of Sherlock in an oval frame, and it says Sherlock lives. And that's the only... I decided that was something... I wouldn't tattoo my body unless I really knew I loved this for life. And certainly it's gotten a lot of mention. I've gone on holidays down south and wearing clothing that could reveal it.
Yeah.
But the only other thing that competes with it is a Rolling Stones logo on my other shoulder.
Oh, two British icons. I love that.
Well, Keith Richards is one of my favorites. So, Sherlock Holmes and Keith Richards, what do they have in common? It might be an interesting essay to do.
Yeah. Well, they're both older than dirt. So, and they keep surviving. This really gives new meaning to the phrase "keeping green the memory of the master."
160 years and 75 years of Keith Richards. It's remarkable.
That's great. Oh, that is fantastic. Well, Wendy, what's next on your list of Sherlockian projects?
Well, right now I'm working on a project, a blog deal that's dealing with Sherlock's disguises and the London street food purveyors of secondhand clothiers. And I also wrote an essay for a book that's being edited by Chris Redmond called Why Sherlock Holmes is Like ... And in it, I compare Sherlock Holmes to Hamlet. So, which I don't ask me why, but it popped into my head, and there really was a lot of things that were parallel between the two men. Not the least of which is that Hamlet is a detective story. And many of the actors who played Sherlock Holmes also played Hamlet. That
is true. And of course, in the BBC series, you've got that skull that sits on the mantelpiece.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah. So, interesting. Well, we will look forward to that. I know it's our intention to speak with Chris again when the book comes out later this year. So, we'll make sure we ask him specifically about your essay.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Well, Wendy, thank you for spending some time with us and sharing this really unique and different approach to Mrs. Hudson. I think it's just so refreshing, and I think it should encourage other scholars out there that it's really a matter of changing your perspective just a little bit and being able to find in the canon and supporting sources the way to actually back up your theory and strengthen it. So, brava to you for doing such a spectacular job. Well, we'll have a link to the site, mrshudsonskitchen.com, in the show notes. The book, of course, Memoirs from Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen. It's available on all of the major online bookstores, and you can read more about it on the website there. Wendy, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott and Bert. I really appreciate it.
Well, now that is a completely different take and a very original approach. There are so many opportunities when you get involved in doing a regular column to think about putting them together and telling a larger story. And I really like the idea of Mrs. Hudson being a neglected and not sufficiently understood and appreciated participant in Baker Street. I mean, that's not a new idea, but I really like that approach. And one of the nice parts about Wendy's book is that she seems to have found, by collecting these columns and re-editing them and presenting them, a nice way to sort of add that dimension to Mrs. Hudson as you amplify what the daily experience was like in Baker Street, with recipes for things that I am very unlikely ever to make, things like toad in the hole, which is, basically eggs and milk and beef kidneys, or leftover mutton. I don't know about you, but I have very little leftover mutton in our house. Yeah,
I tend to clean my plate on the first serving, so, and there ain't nothing like mutton, clearly. But I think, the genius of Conan Doyle's creation here, and we think about some of the mainstays, some of the characters that have lived beyond the pages of the canon, those that authors and filmmakers and producers alike have chosen to make part of their creations themselves. Typically, it's Professor Moriarty, Mycroft Holmes, who, by the way, each of them only appears in 2 stories. It is Inspector Lestrade. These are folks that come up from time to time. But Mrs. Hudson, as Wendy mentioned, appeared in 9 stories. And you think about the fact that so many of these stories did take place at Baker Street. She was somewhere in the background, and she was part of the daily life at Baker Street. And in some ways, it's almost left us a blank slate on which to project our notion of what a landlady, or later, as Vincent Sterrett did, a housekeeper might be, might look like, might personify, might interact. And I think Wendy really did a fine job in, sussing through how Mrs. Hudson came to be the landlady, came to be the owner of the establishment, and how she interacted with Holmes and Watson. And there's still opportunities for others to do the same.
Yeah, I agree, though I just realized we sort of left her off the hook because we had a good discussion about was Mrs. Hudson Martha, and came to the conclusion, at least Wendy did, no. But we haven't found out her view about Mrs. Hudson's first name.
Well, maybe it's worth resurfacing.
I wonder if it was Gladys.
Effie. I don't know. We have no way of knowing. You could assign any Victorian name to it and be convincing. But it probably wasn't Brittany.
Dawn.
Well, I particularly do like Brittany because Watson in his last bow said she personified England. And what better name than Brittany?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know that Watson said that. Wasn't that von Bork who said...
oh, yeah. I think you're right. Yeah.
So with her aura of somnambulant something or other,
Yes. Yeah, because she was sleeping in a chair or something.
Yes. Look, everyone knows that Martha in his last bow was actually Mycroft in a dress.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, she might almost personify Britannia, said he, with her complete self-absorption and general air of comfortable somnolence.
Somnolence, there we are.
The secretary
I'm inspired
said that.
to having an aura of comfortable somnolence.
Well, I think that's pretty much what our listeners have every time we pop open this. Yeah. Oh. All right, well, it is that time. You guessed it, you heard the music. It is time for Canonical Couplets, the great Sherlockian quiz show where we tend to test your knowledge about, just about anything that you could come across in the canon in just 2 lines. Absolutely amazing when you think 2 simple lines could sum up some of these great stories. Now, you'll remember that the last time we had you on here, we gave you this canonical couplet to be identified. To send such relics to a nice old lady implies behavior something worse than shady. Any ideas what that might have been, Bert?
Yes, that was the cardboard treaty, wasn't it?
It was worth the paper it was printed on. Yes, cardboard. You were close, so close, as always. The cardboard box, that's the one, cardboard box.
I knew it was something about cardboard.
Yes, and the relics that were sent, of course, were human ears, freshly severed. We didn't see any recipe for severed ears in Mrs. Hudson's kitchen, unfortunately. It would have, ear. That would have been a good recipe. So, from all of our winners, we need to stick our hand into the revolving drum, of course, waiting until it stops. And it's coming around, and it looks like it stopped on lucky number 11. Okay, and number 11 corresponds with Oh, it looks like it's Nils Gampert. Nils Gampert, you are our winner this time. We'll get you a little keepsake, a little Sherlockian tchotchke of sorts, perhaps printed, and we'll get it off in the mail to you. So thanks for participating, Nils. And now, of course, we have the next round up in Canonical Couplets. Get yourselves ready. Get your ears attuned for this one to win a prize. It's hard to find a workable deterrent for cluxers, both historical and current. If you think you know which canonical story that couplet refers to, send us an email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com, putting canonical couplet in the subject line, and we will be delighted to have you compete for the next prize here on Canonical Couplets.
Well, you know, Mrs. Hudson is not a new subject for Scott and I, and months ago, we wondered why it was that over the years, you know, particularly in the old days, there was never a radio program about the adventures of Mrs. Hudson at 221B Baker Street. And we actually produced an example that has never before been heard until today. So let us know what you think of it. And now it's time for Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen, the story of a woman alone in Victorian London and her struggles to succeed as landlady to the world's first consulting detective. It's spring, 1895, and we are below stairs at 221B Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson has just said good morning to her young nephew Willie, and we hear Willie say, "Gosh, Aunt Martha, it sure is stuffy down here in your kitchen with all those things on the stove." "Oh, Willie, why ever would you call me Aunt Martha?" "Gosh, Aunt Martha." "Why, Martha, that's the kind of name some housekeeper would have if she worked for some German spy. What an idea." "I'm sorry, Auntie, but it still is stuffy down here in your kitchen today. What's that bubbling on the stove? Is it something wonderful for Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson?" "Oh, my mother named me Clytemnestra Antigone. It's a perfectly lovely name. Why, that's a pot of lead there bubbling away." "You're melting lead, Auntie?" "Oh, yes. I pried those bullets out of the wall in Mr. Holmes' room upstairs and melted them all down." "But why do that, Auntie?" "Oh, I'm making lead soldiers, Willie. A whole platoon of them to recreate the Crimean War." "Wow, can I have some, Auntie?" "Oh, that depends on the casualties, Willie." "Could they be a Christmas present for, say, some favorite nephew?" "Oh, no, Willie, I'm going to paint them and package them up for Mr. Hudson to sell in his shop." "Gosh, Auntie, I thought Mr. Hudson was dead." "Oh, that's what we want the insurance company to think, Willie. But no, he has a little shop in the Kennington Road, and these will fit right in. He can't drop these and break them like all those statues." "Oh, be a dear and go see who's at the front door. I have to keep stirring this or it will stick to the pot." "Who was it, Willie?" "Oh, it was a ratty little man with bad breath. He pushed right past me and ran upstairs to Mr. Holmes." "Oh, that will be Inspector Lestrade, out of his depth again. That means..." "Oh, dear. That means Inspector Gregson can't be far behind." "I can't think why we pay that boy in buttons, Willie. He's never around when you need him." "Gosh, Auntie, it sure gets noisy here in Baker Street." "Oh, there they go. That will be Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson and the two policemen. Off to inspect some old corpse, no doubt." "Oh, darn, Auntie. I thought I was going to meet them this time for sure." "Oh, next time perhaps, Willie. Now I've got to get upstairs and clear away the breakfast things and wash the towels and the sheets and open up all the windows up there." "Has Mr. Holmes been doing more of his smelly chemical experiments, Auntie?" "Oh, no, Willie, not lately, no." "Or smoking late at night with the windows closed?" "Oh, I don't think so, Willie. But Dr. Watson is not what you'd call a regular bather, Willie. Now, you keep stirring this pot while I go upstairs and work." "Gosh, Auntie, you sure seem happy about having to do all that cleaning upstairs." "Oh, it's the best part of the day for me, Willie. Nothing cheers me up more than getting out of Mrs. Hudson's kitchen. Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen stars Victoria Secret as Mrs. Hudson and Caldecott Medal as Willie, and is brought to you by the makers of lard, the cook's best friend since the 16th century. Spread some on your oatmeal today. Mrs. Hudson's Kitchen was written, produced, and directed by Stuart David Stewies. This is a Stewed production.
Well, I can't believe we've done it again. We've convinced people to waste an hour with us.
Invest. I don't think of it as wasting. I think it's an investment.
Investment. What's the ROI on being an iHose listener?
Well, the return on investment is uncalculable delight, clearly. Let the joy be unconfined. That's my motto.
Oh, it can be unconfined and uncontrollable. And seeing as I am neither unrefined nor controllable, I will remain Scott Monty.
Oh, and I'm stuck in being Burt Wolder.
Oh, we love it.
The game's afoot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.